Hello everyone, a very good day to all of you. My name is Urvish Yaneja, and I am the director and founder of Digital Futures Lab. We're an India-based think tank that studies the interaction of technology and society in India and other parts of the majority world. The bulk of our work is to look at the political economy of the production of technology and the societal impacts of technology in countries like India and other parts of the majority world. And through that, we develop governance frameworks, policy frameworks, support organizations, whether in government or the private sector, in building their capacities around responsible AI and other technologies. And recently, we've also begun to develop a foresight practice where we try and look at, what are the kind of technology futures that we might all want. Technology policy is often very reactive. And so what we're trying to do also is move from being oppositional to being propositional about the technological futures that we all want. Just a few quick highlights from our work that maybe demonstrate some of the activities that we've been engaged in over the past couple of years. Two kind of flagship projects at DFL over the past year. One has been to look at the intersection of AI and climate action in Asia. This is one of the first studies of its kind where we looked at the role of AI in addressing climate action, as well as the climate impacts of AI across 9 Asian countries, and where we combine kind of primary research along with foresight methodologies and scenario building tools to see how this might unfold in the next decade and a half. Another project that ties together some of the activities that I was mentioning was a recently concluded fellowship program that we had on responsible AI, where we supported social impact organizations in India with high-touch advisory and mentoring, peer learning on their responsible AI journey. So a number of organizations who are kind of at the forefront of digital development in the Indian context were part of our cohort, whether from healthcare and agriculture, and judiciary, a number of other sectors. And this was the Responsible AI Fellowship, and this was the first of its kind in the Indian context. And another piece of work that we've been immensely proud of that has been kind of keeping us busy for the past year at Digital Futures Lab has been this work on gender bias that we are happy to share with you today. As we all know, since the release of ChatGPT, the possibilities offered by large language models and generative AI has kind of captivated public imagination. And in a country like India, it's expected to have the use of these models is expected to have catalytic effects on things like access, on equity. And we already see a number of interventions to use these models in public service delivery, in critical social sectors, etc. But we also know from emerging research that many of these models can be biased, can be toxic, can contain kind of reproduce stereotypes or reproduce social inequalities. And so it's very important to understand early on what those risks might be so that we might find ways that we can mitigate these harms and address these challenges. And so in that context, last year, with the support of the Gates Foundation, we undertook a study on addressing gender bias in Indian large language models. This was a year-long study where we looked at both the use of the customization of some of the open source models that we already see, whether those by Gemini, by Google or Facebook, etc., as well as attempts to build models in the Indian context and specifically their use in social sectors. So today I'm delighted to be able to share this work with you. I'm also delighted to see the number of people that are on this call. I think that's a real a confirmation of the importance of a topic like this and the importance of a topic like this in a country like India. So to kick things off, we're very honored to have with us Mr. Abhishek Singh to deliver the keynote address. Mr. Singh is a career civil servant with 29 years of experience of governance and policy formulation, specializing in the use of technology for improving governance. He's presently posted as Additional Secretary at the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology at the Government of India, with responsibilities of AI and emerging technologies, cybersecurity, and digital skilling. And he's also the CEO of the India AI Mission. He previously served as the CEO of the Karan Yogi Bharat Department of Personnel and Training, as well as the CEO of the NEGD, DIC, and MyGov in the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology. Mr. Singh, thank you so much for joining us and taking out time from your very busy schedule. We would love to hear from you on some of the work that the India AI mission is doing, and any thoughts you have on the topic that we are discussing today around gender bias and Indian large language models. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Urvashi. And first and foremost, I would like to congratulate you and your entire team at the Digital Futures Lab for coming out with this very insightful report with regard to gender biases in LLMs. And it's very interesting that when we look at AI or when we look at technology per se, the issue of bias is inherent in it. Like when we are looking at the larger spectrum of technology and the way digital services are implemented or accessed, or even the availability of technology or means to access technology devices for women, the gender divide is very, very inherent. Uh, AI further accentuates it, as you mentioned, and your report outlines it. But in general, also, when we look at any metric with regard to number of online transactions that are happening across services, whether I look at the number of DigiLocker users, whether I look at UPI transactions, or any such transaction, or the access to smartphones, in most cases, the proportion of women having access to technology is limited, and the gender divide is very, very inherent. During COVID also, we had real examples in which we saw that if it was requiring an access to a smartphone or to a device in a family, invariably the male child used to get access, you get to use it first before the turn of the girl child used to come. So that is like somehow inherent in our patriarchal system of society that we have for a very, very long time. While there is a need to address that, with the need to take measures to make that access to technology more inclusive and remove the gender divide from it, but we need to act a lot more in order to be able to do that. When we come to like usage of AI, especially generative AI, the way generative AI is designed, the way the generative AI is built, especially building models on existing data sets. So when the data sets itself are biased in the sense that they are not fully representative. In the larger context, we always say that most of the LLMs that we are using are trained on Western datasets. They are not trained on Indian datasets, or they are not trained on datasets from the global South or the developing economies. But when we further splice it down, we see that the proportion of women who are represented in the training datasets is much more limited. So and any data set which is not proportional or not as fully representative will have its own limitations, will have its own biases that will come in. And the same thing applies to of course women. But when we go across the non-binary individuals and other communities which are lesser represented, it becomes much more accentuated. In India, again, because the way access technology is there, even across languages, we find that there are certain communities and certain groups of people speaking several languages, their digital footprint is very, very limited. For example, if we look at, say, Wikipedia pages, so number of Wikipedia pages in English would be in millions number, and if you look at Wikipedia pages in Hindi, it will run into few hundreds of thousands. But if you go down to lower languages like Assamese or Bodo or Konkani or Manipuri, the number of content, digital content that's limited is much more. And even that content, whatever is available, is again created mostly by people who look at issues from a male point of view. So there also the whole availability of digital data sets or digital content which is gender neutral is very, very limited. That leads to a lot of biases. In India, again, another problem with that we face, especially with regard to the language. For example, our languages are gender specific. Like in Hindi, and I was just trying several models, and I was just trying to translate a simple sentence like "वह doctor है." And when I did it on Chat GPT, it says they are a doctor, because Chat GPT kind of uses the pronouns they, because it converts were to they, and it says that gender neutral is they. Meta AI did that as he/she is a doctor. But when I tried on our own Bhashini, which we have built for translating across Indian languages, it translate when I write word doctor hai, translate is as to he is a doctor. And when I do that as a wah nurse hai, then it becomes she is a nurse. So again, it's a simple example. It's a Government of India product, and it has that bias. So it's something which is a problem, which is a real. And if we don't kind of be aware of that, if we don't bring in such parameters in the way we train the models, if we don't mitigate those concerns, again the outputs will be very, very limited. Then we are also we also see that and again this is across genders, like the bias towards economically weaker sections of society. That's also inherent in the way LLMs work, because again the data sets are primarily designed with use cases in mind. There will be a financial market solution that will be there, or there will be advanced healthcare solution that will be there. So again, therein the biases of how the society is stratified comes in, and there also the issues with regard to women gets sometimes overlooked. Then if you also look into the issues of like how women are portrayed in the society, like for example, very often most stories even about accomplished women will be uh, about uh, less about what they have done on their own, but very often relate to their family background or their father or their husband, something like that. So that again, the whole digital footprint, the digital content on the internet and on the stories that we read are designed that way, because everything is written from that point of view. So that again kind of brings in the bias in the large language models that we use these data sets to train on. The number of again in India's context, if you look at, very often news about women come in, it's more about crime against women, the violence against women. So that also biases the data that is there. And very often positive stories are not covered, only when they do something differently that gets covered. So that again brings in a lot of biases in the data set that we are there, and creates such kind of outputs which might not be fair. Similar in cases of models which are related to employment related data or statistics, there also, since women are anyway underrepresented in most job roles, the any output that will come from there will again be biased. So the issue is that we need to kind of be aware that these challenges are there. I'm sure the work that you have done, the guidebook that you have prepared, the reports which are there will be something which can serve as a tool for being aware that these are the challenges which are there, and then how do we mitigate that. The real challenges will be like when we design LLM, if we are aware of the kind of mistakes that can happen, the kind of biases that can come in, then there can be tools for mitigating those biases, trying to ensure that the algorithms that we design are able to address them. And when we fine tune, we bring in the cultural nuances. And herein again, every Indian language will be distinct. Like the way gender is used in Bengali, or the way gender is used in Tamil or Malayalam or Konkani or in the Northeast, various languages, these nuances will have to be brought in. This will require a lot of domain experts who understand language, who understand technology. And when we are training these models to bring in that, and we are also trying to build some tools in the India AI mission, which will help address these challenges that we face. Like, of course, the whole overall umbrella, like as we know, India AI mission has got 7 pillars, and we are addressing all issues related to that. And in that, the key ones, of course, are the ensuring availability of compute, then ensuring a data sets, building a data sets platform. And in the data sets platform, we're providing several tools, like not only data sets, but there will be tools for privacy preservation, there will be tools for anonymization. So similarly, there will be tools for evaluating a data set from the gender lens, trying to see whether a data set, suppose it's a data set with regard to certain groups of people who are accessing a particular service, then the proportion of the source data sets is, if it is proportionate to the population sample that we are looking at, that will become part of the data set. So there will be tools to check from the gender point of view, whether the data sets is balanced, fair, and right or not. So that will be there, something on the datasets platform. Then similarly, when we are doing the application development initiative, we launched a challenge for several problem statements. So therein also there will be applications which will be gender specific, which will be ensuring that we are not only addressing the problems that are faced, that are AI amenable and they are faced by one gender. So there will be a whole cross section of challenges for building AI-based solutions that will meet the requirements of both the genders. Then when we do the future skills program, again we do look at it from the gender lens. We do try to see that the fellowships we are giving at various levels, and if we are taking a project, supporting projects for by students in engineering colleges, how is it, it should not happen that we are kind of focusing only on one gender, and projects of other gender are missed out. So of course it will depend on number of applications that we get, but then we do have a proactive policy in order to encourage projects being taken by women students, girl students, and to support them also. Similarly, in the startup financing pillar, we do have a lens with regard to whenever we are taking up startup financing, we do have a preference for all women startups or doing that, so that inherently the issues of gender also gets addressed. In the safe and trusted pillar of the India AI mission, we have taken several projects. We have taken 8 projects which go into the entire gamut of issues, from algorithmic bias to machine learning to looking at cleaning data sets, synthetic data generation. So there also there is a lens of gender there in order to ensure that any data sets that are synthetically created or any data sets that are used for training models are actually looked from the gender point of view. So while the intent is there, but when we actually translate it, sometimes we also need to be vigilant with regard to how it is being done, how it is actually happening. So when we audit or when we like challenge large language model, and that's also an exercise that we are taking. Like even if a LLM is developed, deployed, available, whether it's Chat GPT or whether it's Meta or whether it's Grok or Claude or Servam, so we would need to kind of challenge that LLM by giving prompts in various Indian languages. And when we are doing so, we will need to create prompts which are gender specific and try to see how they perform. So when we do that, we'll be actually be able to detect if there are any biases knowingly or unknowingly built in that model, and that will ensure that the feedback goes to the developers and then they are able to correct that. So that will be something that will be an ongoing work, and I'm sure the work that Digital Futures Lab has done in this context will come in handy, will prove to be very useful, and and we will be able to mitigate this challenge to some extent. So I'm of course would never claim that we will be able to make LLMs and will be able to make AI-based solutions totally gender neutral, but at least if it is there in the checklist, if it's there in the design, if it's there in the approach that we are taking, we will be able to mitigate the problems to some extent, because the genesis of the issue is from data sets which are biased. The genesis of the issue is from the gender divide that exists in access to technology in various forms. Even if we look at skilling, the number of projects that we take for skilling people in technology, the proportion of girl students, the proportion of women who are taking up is limited. And traditionally, it has always felt that if there's anything to be done with the technology, it has to be men. So that also brings in biases. But we will need to undertake not only technological solutions, but a lot of awareness and making the entire society also aware of the problem that is there. We are a patriarchal society, but if we allow technology to further accentuate this problem, then it will further complicate things. So we'll need to be aware of the risks which are there. We'll need to be aware of how we can mitigate that. And I am sure with the work that's happening all over, with the work that you guys are doing and the work that's happening globally in this regard, the OECD also has taken up some projects in their direction. At the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence also, there is a move to take measures to make LLM outputs gender neutral. The big LLM companies, the big tech companies are also conscious of this challenge that is there. And I'm hopeful that in the due course, we will be able to address these challenges in a great way. So happy to thank you for giving me this opportunity. Happy to share my thoughts and look forward to listening from the real experts who are there on your panel, who will be able to give greater insights with regard to how we can together uh, kind of address this challenge of making LLM outputs more gender neutral.
Thank you, sir. I think you so articulately pointed out both the kind of root causes of the issue, the scale of the issue, and also, in some sense, the impossibility of addressing the issue in its absolute sense, right? That, as long as we live in a society that is biased, gender bias is also going to continue, and these models will continue to replicate it. So we need to be aware, we need to be vigilant about it. And it was also fantastic to hear about the tools that the India AI mission is going to be building under the safe and trusted AI pillar. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there. There's also probably a lot of lessons that India has to share with other countries as we build those tools across different languages, across different social sectors as well. One question that I had, sir, was that, over the past couple of years, we have also seen a lot of AI being deployed already. In some sense, compared to many other countries, India is quite further ahead in terms of the use of AI for many critical social sectors. Do you also think that we now need kind of post-deployment monitoring and evaluation, or as part of kind of addressing what some of these issues are, building an evidence base of what works, what doesn't work? Or does it feel that it's still too early in the Indian context to be thinking about kind of post-deployment monitoring and evaluation?
Like, as I said, what we need to do is that whenever we have any LLM, and LLMs can have biases. Gender bias is one part of it, but there can be multiple biases. They can have racial biases in India. They can have caste biases, religion-based biases. There can be multiple biases in any large language model. But when anything is being deployed at large and it has a potential of causing harm, and some of these divisions in the society, whether it's religion related or caste related, and if they have like biased responses to that, can really, really result in a lot of trouble. Gender also it does, but since gender doesn't result in violence immediately or something like that, we are more tolerant of that. But what we will need to do is that we will need to subject all the models which are being deployed through a hackathon or through a challenge round in which we kind of test them, in which we give prompts in various languages wherein these factors are kind of tested, tried. And in case, just like I mentioned, ki Bhashini is giving a wrong prompt. So this feedback will go to the team and then they will be able to take measures. So maybe we will, Singapore did something recently a few weeks back in which they kind of tested these models with prompts of all kinds and tried to say where these models fail or where they kind of stop conforming to the ethical or responsible guidelines. So maybe we could also do something like that when we test these models or solutions which have been deployed with various kinds of prompts in Indian languages, and therein gender can be one of the parameters in which we test them, and we see which model or which solution responds in what manner. And I'm sure this feedback will be taken positively, because gender is something which every company is sensitive of. No company will say that no, we are patriarchal, we don't care. So they will take this feedback and they will correct it. So maybe that can be one way of solving this challenge that we have.
I guess always with ideas like this and plans like this, the question is often how. How do we go from kind of how do we realize that vision that we have? And so I wanted to ask you on what you see, as the role of the kind of research ecosystem in the country when we look at kind of advanced AI economies like the US and China. I mean, part of what they have is obviously the core technical talent in computer science departments, but what they've also been able to do is build very strong linkages between the research ecosystem. And again, not just the computer science departments, but also the social science and the humanities. Some of the leading kind of thinkers in technology companies are now anthropologists and philosophers of technology. So how do we kind of catalyze that research ecosystem in India and build those linkages between research and industry? And I assume that we will need to do that also in some sense to also realize some of the plans and the steps that you've outlined for the India AI mission?
Like, first and foremost, if we have to be anywhere near to what US or China is, we'll have to increase the investment that we do in AI research. Presently, the amount of money that we put in or the amount of work that's happening in India is much less compared to what US and China is doing. So we need to push forward overall AI research in almost all fields. And more importantly, in order to ensure that the AI that we build is responsible, is ethical, is safe, and trusted, we'll need to have cross-sectoral teams. It cannot be only computer scientists and code writers who are building AI. There have to be, since ultimately AI will be deployed at scale and there'll be users from across the society. There has to be social scientists, there has to be psychologists, there has to be anthropologists, there are historians who look into how AI is being developed. So that would require that approach to be taken. And the under safe and trusted pillar, the projects that we have taken up, the 8 projects that are already being implemented, all of them are trying to build similar cross-sectoral teams, and that would lead to that. In addition, we'll need to also think of what are the other aspects in which we need to kind of undertake projects and try to see how AI development of AI can proceed. So there will be need of more research projects which are looking into dimensions of this technology and its application which are not entirely technology oriented. What impact it creates, what value it creates, how does it, different sections of society foresee it. The same model can have different outputs for maybe a 8-year-old child to an 80-year-old man, because different people are accessing the same technology, and their worldview, their perceptions are also different. So we'll have to kind of think of the ways and means in which it can be customized for giving such outputs, and that will require a lot of research, a lot of experts from non-technical sectors looking into this. So research has to be promoted overall, but when we do research, it should not only be in the technical field, it should involve non-technical folks also to try to see how these models respond in different scenarios.
Thanks, sir. And finally, just a last question on regulation. I think there's been a lot of, speculation on what India's approach is going to be. Are we going to kind of follow the EU approach with a kind of overarching set of guidelines like the EU AI Act, or we have the kind of Chinese approach, which is much more application specific, where you have separate rules for social media, separate rules for generative AI. So any thoughts or anything you would like to share on how India is thinking about its kind of approach, particularly to foundation models or frontier models from a policy and governance perspective?
Right now, the official stated position that our minister and secretary have kind of highlighted earlier is that our approach is innovation oriented. We are not thinking of regulating the industry before it develops, because our strength lies in our capabilities of building AI use cases and applications. However, having said that, to some extent, the existing laws and provisions do apply to AI-based products and solutions also, because AI is ultimately a form of technology only, and ultimate objective of law is to regulate harm that happens to individuals, a group of people, or communities, or society in general. So if there is any tool which is resulting in something which is a crime, like promotion of pornography or misinformation, misleading, cheating, forgery, so these are all established crimes which are listed in the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, the Indian Penal Code, the new version of Indian Penal Code, Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita, and also there are provisions in IT Act which also relate to many of these offences. Having said that, there might be certain other scenarios in which the applicability of these laws will be limited when it's compared to the harm that can be caused. So in that scenario, if the need is felt, then there will be a regulatory approach, there will be a law that might be required. But presently, we are kind of managing, ensuring the existing legal provisions are sufficient. In the approaches to doing that, also the EU does have a risk-based approach, and China has a more stringent kind of policy towards regulating AI, wherein everything is disclosed to the state authorities. So we are neither subscribing to the Chinese view or to the EU view. Our approach is to drive innovation, prevent user harm, and look at it from the point of view of damage it can cause. So if the existing laws prove to be not sufficient, then only there will be a need of a new law.
Thank you, sir. And I think a really important point that you mentioned is, that we do have already in our toolkit a number of laws and policies that we can use to regulate AI. We don't necessarily need to kind of reinvent the wheel for something like AI, especially with such a fast-moving technology. Even a couple of years ago, we would not have thought about generative AI and large language models having the kind of impact that they could, which is, I think, a really important reminder to all of us that, the technology itself will also keep changing, and we shouldn't lose sight of what we already have. With that, thank you very much, sir, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. Again, I think it was a very ambitious and at the same time kind of very grounded set of remarks on like where we currently are, the importance of addressing the issue, and what the steps that the India AI mission is taking to already that will be taking to address them. So thank you very much, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
With that, I'd now like to bring in my colleague, Arushi Gupta, who is a research manager at Digital Futures Lab. Arushi will share the findings from our work on gender bias in Indian large languages. And following that, we'll move into a panel discussion. Just a quick housekeeping note that if you do have any questions for Arushi, please do park them using the chat function. We'll be collecting the questions at the end of her discussion, as well as at the end of the panel, and then posing them back to both Arushi as well as to the panelists. So Arushi, over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Urvashi. And a big thank you to Mr. Singh also for making my job in terms of context setting 10 times easier for that brilliant keynote address. Very quickly, I will start with a quick preview of the background and context that acts as a backdrop to our research study. So specifically speaking, with respect to large language models in India, we do see a booming ecosystem of a variety of initiatives with respect to Indian languages and large language models. We have a variety of actors that are involved in developing pre-trained models that are predominantly trained on Indian languages, given that many of the existing global LLMs still lack in terms of capabilities while catering to Indian languages, especially those that are lesser resourced, such as the regional languages, including Tamil, Assamese, Kannada, etc. We also see a couple of actors engaged in large-scale data collection curation efforts, specifically curating the data sets that really fuel the LLMs and allow them to learn the semantic structures of the various linguistic nuances in India. And lastly, we have a third category of actors that is focused on developing applications, user-facing applications using these base models. Coming directly to the social sector, which is the larger context of our study, a quick summary of what's really happening in the Indian ecosystem. We have a variety of user-facing applications that are being developed specifically for the task of information sharing and providing access to accurate synthesized information in local languages, especially for critical social sectors such as healthcare, such as finance, agriculture, etc. And the idea is that users in their language can enter a query that is very much specific to their immediate context, and the LLM can be customized in a way that it returns a very contextually nuanced answer to the said query. But at the same time, as both Mr. Singh and Urvashi discussed, we do see an increasing pile of instances, anecdotes, and research studies that point towards the many issues that LLMs hold, including biases in terms of gender. And as we all know, one of the most popular examples has been around the general categorization or characterization of doctors and engineers as males. However, nurses and teachers often represented as females in the many types of outputs that LLMs generate. What you see, however, is most of the headlines right now, they are emerging mostly from Europe, US context, and they are mostly focused on the English language. There is still much to learn about biases that emerge when LLMs are implemented in a country like India, which has a diverse, distinct constellation of sociocultural settings and languages. And with LLMs increasingly being adopted for high-stakes social sector use cases, it is even more pertinent to understand some of these issues. So with that backdrop, we initiated this study in August 2023, asking two very fundamental questions. First, what are the sources of gender bias and their manifestations in LLMs that are pre-trained predominantly on Indian languages or those that have been customized for Indian languages? Second, how can we address some of these issues and advance gender equity in the development and deployment of some of these models? And in exploring these questions, we not only looked at the applications that are currently being piloted across sectors, but we also looked at some of the base models that have emerged in the last 1.5 years, especially specifically their data collection and training mechanisms, because that is one of the most predominant activity that is currently going on. Now, for our study, in terms of the approach and methods, we really used a variety of research methods given the complex nature of this topic. We conducted a series of in-depth interviews with organizations that were building LLM applications in social sectors such as agri and healthcare. And we understood through those interviews, what the process looks like of putting together an LLM application for a marginalized user, for a critical social sector, as well as understanding what are the different points at which concerns around gender equity emerge. And for some of these organizations, we were also lucky to accompany them and really observe their operations in terms of, as you can see, a user onboarding session in Udaipur, as well as a user testing session in Mumbai. And once we'd finished some of these primary research aspects of the study, we developed a set of working hypotheses that we also validated through a 2-day workshop with experts, where we invited people from across different fields such as digital development, application development, data collectors, civil society organizations, who could really speak to the many different facets of the research problem and provide us with an accurate, realistic description of what's really happening in the different corners of the LLM ecosystem when it comes to Indic language models. Lastly, we also had our partner Quicksand Studios, which conducted a few prompting experiments, as you can see on the right hand of the screen, with users from low resource, underserved communities in Bombay, Bangalore, and Goa. And that really helped us gain a very grounded understanding of how users in these contexts are interacting with a chatbot like interface that is powered by an LLM. Jumping quickly into research findings that emerged from our study, one of the key aspects was really defining, before we get into anything else, is what do we really mean when we talk about gender biases in LLMs? Now, much of the scholarship on this subject defines gender biases as stereotypes, as prejudices, or discriminatory patterns that are linked to a particular gender. And in LLMs specifically, they can manifest in the form of word associations, or they can emerge in the form of overt responses that are exclusionary of women perspectives or non binary perspectives. But very early on in the project, we realized that just looking at stereotypes and outputs or the semantics of it all isn't enough. Given the many structural inequalities faced by women in India, especially with respect to technology, we took a much broader view of the concept. We expanded it to not only include stereotypes and semantics, but also the many equity concerns that emerge when LLMs are introduced in a low resource setting like India. So, first, from a relevance perspective, we defined and expanded our definition to also include LLM tools that can be biased if they're mostly designed to cater to an archetypal male user and thus do not really hold a lot of relevance for female users. So, to give you an example, a gender blind agricultural LLM chatbot, for instance, will not be able to cater to the unique needs and capacities of, let's say, female agricultural workers and female farmers, and especially the challenges that they face within the Indian context. Second, from a risk perspective, we also expanded the definition to include instances where an LLM tool, the risks that it poses, affect women disproportionately vis-a-vis other genders. So, for example, an LLM deployed in, let's say, content moderation might fail to adequately recognize or filter gender-based hate speech, leaving women more vulnerable to online harassment, for instance. And lastly, from an accessibility lens, we of course noted that the persistent gender digital divide very inherently makes LLMs biased against female users, especially in context where there is a lack of ownership, there is shared ownership of smartphones, there is data poverty that is prevalent in many of these areas, right? This thus affecting how women experience and access these models. Next is the I think, some of the more substantive parts of our research findings, where we, all the research findings that we had in relation to LLM applications, we sort of arranged them across the LLM lifecycle. So, what you see on your screen here is the different stages that are involved in building an LLM application, right? We start with, of course, the problem discovery stage, where organizations are really scoping out the key use case that their application is going to serve, what challenges it is going to address, how do LLMs really fit into this particular use case. And then, with that in mind, there is a bit of reiteration, scoping out of selecting the right off the shelf model or pre trained LLMs, such as GPT, such as Llama, that can be then further customized for the use case selected. Next, we have the model customization stage, where organizations typically break it up into two parts. One is, of course, acquiring the right data to customize the model, but as well as preparing the data and feeding it into the LLM to customize it furthermore. Right, and at this stage, we see that there's translations that are happening, word embedding models are being used, as well as annotations that take place. After that, we of course have evaluation, UI design, and application rollout. Evaluation is definitely a very important aspect of the life cycle, where organizations are specifically looking for metrics around accuracy, relevance of the outputs produced, and any hallucinations that might be prevalent within the application they've built. UI design and rollout is really much at the fag end of the life cycle, where organizations are putting together the interface that end users are going to use to interact with the underlying model, as well as the final stage, which is just deploying and rolling out the application in a real world context. So, what we did is, for each of these stages, we realized that there are concerns around gender biases that emerge throughout the life cycle. They're not necessarily limited to one part of the life cycle. And what I've done is I've categorized them across three different key aspects. So, the second column that you see is around sources of gender bias, and this basically highlights all the sources or reasons as to why an LLM application may exhibit bias in the first place, right? Either in all the four forms that were discussed earlier: stereotypes, irrelevance, disproportionate harms, or accessibility barriers. This third column sums up the various bias blind spots that we observed that are often present within LLM projects. These are not necessarily sources of bias per se, but rather are reasons why gender biases go unchecked throughout the life cycle. And the last column highlights barriers to bias mitigation. And so basically, no matter how gender sensitive the developmental process of an application is, there are certain systemic exogenous factors that organizations have to reckon with that make it quite challenging to debias a model from a gender lens. So, for today's presentation, I will talk through some of these aspects in the slides that follow, and in the interest of time, I'll focus primarily on two stages. One is the model customization stage and the model evaluation stage, as they are the ones most specific to LLMs. So, quickly moving on to the model customization stage, and this is at by this point, organization would have typically done the problem scoping and selected the base model that they want to customize further. And as part of their customization process, they would be collecting and preparing the data. In terms of data collection, it could either be sourced from existing public corporas, but at the same time, in case there are glaring gaps in terms of the use case that they've selected, a lot of organizations also engage in fresh data collection from their target user communities. In terms of data preparation, it can really entail a variety of steps, and this is just one specific model of how that customization phase might look like, which it might include translating the data into the desired language. It might include annotating and labeling it in order to make it more amenable to be fed into an LLM. And lastly, it may also involve converting that textual data into vectors, which is like a machine readable format that can be interpreted by the LLMs, right? Now, in terms of the sources of gender bias that emerge at this stage, and I think Mr. Singh also summed up this perfectly, that this is also a very multi-layered problem. So one of the primary sources is, of course, as we all know, is the data that the model is learning for. And there are issues of representation that can take different forms. First is, of course, just in terms of sheer representation in the form of numbers, that there are fewer fewer females that are represented in the data sets that are used for training models. But over and above that, we also see, in terms of data richness, there is limited research on women's needs and capacity that also lends itself to a major gender blind spot within existing training data sets. And over and above this issue of underrepresentation, we also discovered that there's a third category of issues around misrepresentation. And this is when training data can actually carry stereotypes, patriarchal sociocultural norms, or any sort of regressive beliefs that might be encoded in the data. So, for instance, in the case of, let's say, a sexual and reproductive healthcare chatbot that is being built by an organization, the knowledge sources that they might be using to train the model may be encoded with regressive views around, let's say, the gendered roles of child rearing between parents, for example, which in turn may get further entrenched and reproduced by the final LLM application that is being put together. The second step in terms of data preparation um, is firstly involves the data that is being collected, being translated into a desired language and annotated before being converted into embeddings. In terms of the translation, as you can see, we we discovered that this is another important source of gender bias, especially when data from a gender neutral language like English is translated to a language which has grammatical gender, such as Hindi. So, for instance, we've provided here an example of an English to Hindi translation. And while the statements that you see on the left hand side are gender neutral, with cab driver and nurse appearing as neutral words, however, the machine translation assigns them by default a masculine form. So, both the occupational terms, cab driver, nurse, they were clubbed with male specific and female specific terms, respectively, reflecting common stereotypes that we've all seen around genders and professions. Right? In terms of the next step after translation is the annotation process, which is basically the process of labeling or tagging data sets to ensure that they're structured and that they're meaningful for training and customizing the model. And properly annotated data can really help minimize gender stereotypes in training data sets. But what we saw is that this is not always a straightforward task. While certain manifestations of gender bias are objective and often easily recognized, let's say the gender wage gap or women in leadership positions, etc., there are other forms of gender biases that are more subtle and more nuanced, and they often are expressed through language, through behavior, and practices that really vary across different subcultures, especially within the Indian context. And identifying such subtle forms of gender bias during data annotation is very challenging, including factors such as annotator identity and personal perspectives playing a big role in how annotators really perceive a textual data and classify it as either abusive or not, right? And this challenge is particularly pronounced in the Indian context, where there is a lack of comprehensive contextual understanding of how gender bias and LLMs manifest for a specific use case, for a specific language, or for a specific sector. And in the absence of such kind of guidance, we do see that it might be difficult for annotators to really flag issues, especially if they hold their own biased preconceptions. Right? Um, the next step and the final step within the model customization stage is, once that the organizations have curated the data sets, they typically break it down into document chunks. And these chunks are then transformed into embeddings through a word embedding model. Now, in case the organizations are using an embedding model that itself contains gendered word associations, there is a probability that the customized model will also inherit the same biases. So we know from existing research, for instance, word embedding models like Word2Vec and FastTech, especially for Hindi and Tamil, do have caste biases and gender biases, such as those associated with words around politician, commander being much more closer spatially to the word male, vis-a-vis words like maid and cook being much more associated with the female word. Moving on to the next stage, which is stage 4 of model evaluation. And at this stage, what we saw from our research is that organizations typically use a very nuanced, domain sensitive approach. They either involve domain experts who can comment on the veracity of the LLM outputs for metrics such as accuracy, relevance, etc. And a lot of the organizations also involved their end users who could give them feedback on the contextual relevance and whether a particular output that an LLM is producing is easily understandable or not. But at the same time, in terms of gender biases and gender based evaluation, we saw that the gender blind evaluations per se are quite common and they can take different forms, right? So, for instance, even for metrics such as ease of comprehension and contextual relevance, these are quite gendered in nature, which is to say that experiences across women and men as users will differ. However, organizations might not always apply a gender lens while evaluating some of these metrics. We also saw that while in the evaluation stage, domain experts might be involved, gender experts rarely are as part of the evaluator cohort. Uh, and over and above these bias blind spots, there are, of course, challenges that organizations have to reckon with. Similar to the annotation stage, we do see that the process of even evaluating an LLM textual output for gender biases is a fairly subjective exercise, especially given the lack of dedicated benchmarks and any sort of standardized or formulaic approaches that can guide organizations in doing so. With this, we sort of conclude the life cycle aspect and looking at the different sources of gender biases within end user applications. But we now move a little upstream and look at the different pre trained Indian LLMs. And these are specifically those that have emerged in the last 1.5 years. And the main idea here has been to really collect large amounts of textual data that will enable large language models cater more accurately to Indian languages and build models that are much more tailored to the Indian context. And thus, a lot of these efforts are typically addressing issues of low resourcedness of many of the Indian languages. Um, but when we applied a gender lens, we sort of looked at two aspects of this initiative. One is, of course, data extraction from online sources. And we saw that developers are often using a scrape first, ask later approach, since, of course, the priority is to cross thresholds for largeness in data rather than optimize for equity, fairness. And we noted that many of these practices might risk amplifying existing biases in the data because the unfiltered inclusion of content may really disproportionately reflect dominant narratives, exclude marginalized voices, and particularly those of women who we know face data invisibility because of their lack of access or limited access to technology. For the second aspect, which was around community data collection, there are a lot of initiatives currently on ground in India which focus on collecting large amounts of voice data or text data that can power some of these indigenous LLMs. But especially from the interviews with some of these people who were on the ground doing that data collection, we were able to discuss that it's difficult to really ensure female participation even in such on ground efforts, because of course restrictive social norms. And we had data collectors telling us that it's often difficult to engage and access female participants, as many of their interactions were mediated and moderated by the male members in their family. Similarly, for crowdsourcing initiatives where there is community led data collection, but it's mostly the contributors from these crowdsourcing initiatives are mostly coming from educated urban backgrounds. And this is also one of those avenues where we do see underrepresentation of female voices, marginalized voices, especially those with lower levels of formal education and digital literacy. Um, Now, zooming out a little bit, and having discussed the different forms of gender biases, it's also important to understand as to why is it that we need to address these biases and what implications do they hold if they are left unchecked. And we categorize them into three big buckets. We categorize the implications as A, as perpetuation of stereotypes, right? If LLMs continue to carry gender biases and other social biases around caste, for instance, especially within the Indian context, there is a high risk that they will further entrench users' biases as well and sort of reinforce them within the real world. Second is around exclusion, and this is extremely pertinent as we see LLMs continue to get deeply integrated with public service delivery within critical social sectors like healthcare, like gender based violence, etc. And this is where we see that gender blind LLM tools can really further widen the gender gap that exists in these sectors, further raising the barriers for access for women for some of these use cases. The third is, of course, a risk based perspective, but specifically for context where we see that there is a lack of informational literacy, or we do see a big risk that the indiscriminate deployment of LLMs in some of these areas can really risk over reliance on these tools, where we know that people and women, especially for sensitive cases like sexual health, like gender based violence, domestic violence, do not have alternative sources of information and peer support. And over reliance, especially if the LLMs are prone to hallucinations, can really pose actual physical and mental well being harms on some of these women who are users of these tools. Right? Finally, moving on to the recommendations part based on the findings that we've developed. Now, given the complex nature of the issues we unearthed, we also very quickly realized that the recommendations will have to be developed and articulated at different tiers of the ecosystem. So, accordingly, we have one set of recommendations that is targeted towards application developers in the downstream. But given that the back end of LLMs and the massive machinery that drives their behavior, we know that a lot of aspects of this problem that we've just discussed are not within the capacity or ambit of a single organization, right, or a single app developer. Rather, there are slightly more systemic interventions that are needed from governments, from upstream model developers, that can in turn support some of these numerous organizations who are involved in on ground implementation of LLMs. So, starting with the application development point of view, we sort of looked at the entire life cycle and we pointed critical priority action items that we really recommend organizations to undertake in order to take a much more gender sensitive but also much more gender responsive approach in their development strategy. So we firstly recommend that depending on the use case, the context, and the problem that they're tackling, as well as the target community they're catering to, organizations should really undertake a gender analysis of the problem space. And this includes understanding how a particular developmental challenge is experienced by women, what their needs are, what their capacities are. And such a gender analysis needs to be then factored into the formulation of the LLM solution, as, of course, part of a larger exercise in developing a theory of change, right? So, here we encourage application developers to ask these pertinent questions. Can LLMs address this challenge? And if yes, then how? And will the introduction of LLMs widen gender gaps in this context, etc., and so on and so forth? Now, for the model and the data stage, we recommend that organizations should really carve out some time to assess sources of bias in the data sets that they're curating and building. And this can be done through either building that capacity in house or through external consultations. This will help provide visibility over the application's blind spots and then, of course, accordingly help them develop mitigation strategies in the subsequent stages. In terms of evaluation, we realize, of course, that we do need many of the systemic interventions that we'll discuss shortly. But at the same time, in terms of just the broader approach in mental model that an organization needs to follow, is to conduct early and iterative testings on their models through looping in end users, domain experts, but also digital development professionals who can offer more grounded insights around what works and what doesn't for a particular context, for a particular tech intervention. And lastly, given the rapid pace with which LLM projects are being piloted in India, we also recommend continuous attention and investment towards monitoring and evaluation. And this is imperative not only from the POV of an organization to track impact and measure progress, but also for the wider development and policy community, as it can help us build evidence around the efficacy of LLM solutions, especially within the larger discourse around AI for social good. Now, many of these efforts that we just discussed at an organization level also need to be supplemented by initiatives at a systemic level. And to that end, we do recommend some of these key priority action items, including the creation of local language data sets that can facilitate gender bias evaluation, and these that not only cater to different languages and dialects, but also, based on our research, we saw that many of these gender biases vary from context to context and sector to sector. So, the gender bias is the form and manifestations that it will take for a healthcare application will be very different from the form that it takes for an agriculture application. And for this, we need on ground work, we need articulation of these insights. And for this, we also need collaborations between the research community as well as on ground application developers. Now, secondly, given that there is a booming data economy around LLMs with large scale data collection efforts currently going on, we need to establish clear guidelines and standards that can really help actors engaged in this to then make their data sets more transparent, more auditable, as well as really provide practical guidance around how to uphold privacy of their data principles when curating such data sets. And similar sort of approach and guidance is needed across different parts of the supply chain. And most importantly, we see that there is a lot of manual labor that goes into cleaning and annotating data sets that power LLMs, right? And to that end, we need clear standards that can ensure fair compensation, recognition, and ethical treatment of these data workers. And just a last point, which is around with LLMs increasingly becoming ubiquitous in the social sector, we also need some sort of on ground mobilization, especially in terms of community engagement, awareness campaigns that really demystify LLMs for the public at large. And these could really be aimed towards building those critical media literacy, informational literacy that is needed, that they can assess the limitations for LLMs and really choose for themselves what is useful and what is really hallucinated or just outright risky when it comes to LLM outputs. I think with that, I'll quickly hand it back over to you, Urvashi, to take us through then the next segment of the webinar, or in case, happy to field any questions that we have.
Thanks, Arushi. Thank you for providing that presentation. And I know we covered a lot of ground. So do have a look at the report. The links are in the chat. And if you have any questions for Arushi, please also just put them in the chat. And my colleague Sasha will be collecting them, and we'll post them to Arushi at the end of the panel. And some of the questions might also be relevant for the panel as well. I'd now like to move on to the last segment of today's program, which is the panel discussion. And I'm delighted to have with us some of the leading kind of thinkers and practitioners in this space. Who are joining us today. We have Nidhi Bhasin, who is the CEO of Digital Green Trust, Danish Pruthi, the Assistant Professor at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore, Kalika Bali, a Senior Principal Researcher at Microsoft Research India, Anayata Singh, the Program Officer at Digital and AI at the Gates Foundation, Saurabh Khan, the founding member of Sarvam AI, and Safia Hussain, the co-founder and chief impact officer of at Karya. Thank you all for joining us. I feel like I could talk to you all for a very long time, and this conversation would be hard to kind of curtail in the time that we have together. But I hope we can at least cover some ground in terms of what the issues are and what the way forward might be in the Indian context. So Kalika, perhaps I could start with you. I think Arushi spoke in the beginning of the presentation about just like the difficulty in even understanding what bias is in the Indian context, especially when we start bringing in an intersectional lens. And then we also, there's obviously the linguistic and semantic aspect of it, but then there's the societal aspect of it, which Mr. Singh also touched upon in his opening remarks. So what are some of the kind of cultural, linguistic, or computation specific factors that make it difficult to address gender bias, or that we need to kind of build into our mental model when we're thinking about how to solve for this issue of gender bias in the Indian context?
Yeah, I think Mr. Singh and then Arushi have covered the entire spectrum of what can be said about gender bias in India. But very briefly, I think from the linguistic perspective, one of the things that we really have to be aware of is how the grammatical gender varies so much across all the languages that exist in our country. Even if we look at like just the 22 official languages, there is like, no grammatical gender in Bangla to like a very complex grammatical gender in Hindi, right? And every shade in between. So just having to deal with like the example Mr. Singh gave of doctor and nurse, right? Just having to deal with something as simple as that is quite a complex task. So that's one aspect, say from a linguistic perspective. The second, from like you said, the cultural perspective, there is, I mean, this is such a diverse country socio-culturally, and what counts as bias is quite varied across different socio-cultural groupings, right? So what may be, a very very strong gender bias in one cultural as one cultural norm can be not a bias in another cultural norm. So I think the way and computationally, of course, like the data that we have is does not really represent the biases or represents. So we have two kinds of data. One data is so cleaned that we really don't know. It might be called gender neutral, but I kind of like the phrase that the Gates Foundation used, which is gender aware, right? So if you kind of scrub it clean, you're cleaning away a lot of other things as well, a lot of other information as well. So we have that kind, or we have data which obviously represents all the biases that exist in society, even a lot more, like Mr. Singh has said. And my starting point for everything is that what is it that you're trying to do with the AI that you have? I mean, of course, at the model sense, and lots of people have made that comment that on the model side, there'll never be a perfectly unbiased model. And there are lots of people who are working on algorithmic biases, etc., to deal with that. But my thing in a country like India to tackle this is to kind of have a very clear perspective of what is it that you're doing with the AI application, and does it work in the same way for the men as well as the women and all the genders in between that you're trying to cater of your target audience. And that should be the starting question. And then like looking into why it is not working, because it doesn't, believe me, it doesn't work as well across the genders. So, and then working yourself through all of this. So I'll stop here.
I mean, it seems like an almost intractable problem, right? Or the scale of the problem is so large and so complex. And in some sense, it seems like also what you're suggesting is that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we almost take a kind of use case approach to it, or an application kind of approach to it. Is that correct?
At least in the short term, we take a use case and application based, which is not to say that we should stop looking at the bigger model side of things and only focus, but just to know where to start. I mean, think about it. We do not even have evaluation data sets for all the languages to even identify and evaluate what kind of gender biases are there. And anyone who's worked in this field will tell you that just translating data sets from English or Spanish or whichever language is your favorite, which has these data sets into Indian language doesn't work. Bias does not translate. Like just
So kind of,
yeah.
so use case by use case, application by application approach,
While we
which were
keep
then also.
working on the other side of things.
And I guess that also kind of reinforces then the importance of doing that documentation and that learning, monitoring, evaluation alongside.
Absolutely. So the three things, like I think people have alluded to this earlier: identification, evaluation, and then mitigation. If we cannot identify in a rigorous, objective manner bias that exists, and evaluate to say how bad it is or not, right? Or what kind it is or not. How will we mitigate? We can't reach mitigation before we identify and evaluate.
Yeah. Thanks, Kalika. And Danish, perhaps I can bring you in here. So even in Mr. Singh's remarks in the beginning, he spoke about how the India AI mission is going to be building tools for debiasing, as well as various other paths to ensure kind of the safety and security of these applications. So, and what Kalika is talking about is a much more application-specific approach to kind of identifying what the bias is. What is your perspective on this? What do we currently know about the kind of effectiveness of popular debiasing strategies? Do they work in the Indian context? What is the kind of work that is needed to help mitigate some of these bias? Let's say we've done that step of identification that Kalika is talking about.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, in short, we have a long way to go. These methods aren't as effective, and I think first articulating what is the desired output can also be quite challenging. I'd like to give you maybe a very trivial example. Let's say you are generating images of CEOs, you would want maybe a fair representation, maybe half men, half women. For instance, if you apply similar techniques, and if you ask models to generate US presidents, they end up generating, let's say, half men, half women, which is not just factually inaccurate, but also is insulting to women. It's a shame we never had a US women president. And at the same time, you are like generating, or like, yeah, it could be very insulting. So similar techniques just don't translate between, let's say, just two occupations, being presidents or being CEOs. So we really need to, I think, there's a lot of difficulty in general in just articulating what is the aspired goal and what we want. So I think that's where some of the devising techniques focus on, or should focus on. There were, I think, like we were talking about word-to-vec and other embedding-based approaches and how they itself carry some problematic associations. And there were, I think, past work that were just trying to scrub off any elements of gender in it. But I think Kalika made a really good point that you really don't want to be scrubbing those effects off, but rather making them more aware about nuances related to gender. So yeah, I think some of the, again, like some devising approaches also look at ways to augment data and improve data. They have had some limited success, but again, collecting data in a co-participatory way across languages with like special care towards like diverse needs is very, very challenging, and it's not just like a easy technical challenge. Yeah, it's not a technical challenge. It's a much broader challenge. Yeah.
And from where you currently sit at, do you see this kind of work happening, or the kind of collaboration that would be required to get this off the ground? Or is there something in terms of investments that can be made in this space to further some of the work that you're talking about?
Yeah. And that's a great question. I think like people are keenly building evaluation sets that are more exhaustive than what we have seen before. They're maybe more sensitive to Indian context, Indian axis of discrimination, let's say caste, religion, socioeconomic status. Kalika has done some work in this area as well. There are like other organizations, including Digital Futures Lab, TATL, for instance, AI for Bharat. So I think there are some. I mean, it's not like the. I mean, we are still lacking in the scale of the effort, but I'm glad that at least a few groups are discussing and working towards those areas.
Thanks, Danish. Saurabh, if I could turn to you now, so you're someone who's been kind of deeply engaged in the kind of ecosystem, and as you know, working at an organization that is in some sense at the frontier of trying to build an Indian-based models for different languages. Arushi also spoke about in her presentation about the tendency sometimes, because we're trying to achieve something that is such an ambitious kind of task, and we're also trying to do it in kind of record time, that sometimes there can be a tendency to kind of scrape first, ask later. So how are we thinking about gender in the work that you're currently doing, or just broadly your reflections in the ecosystem, and how can we try and make gender considerations a more central part of the conversation?
Yeah, and thank you so much for that question. I think, I mean, I'll be saying the same stuff that everyone else like said before me. There are certain aspects of these kind of models that has never been the characteristic of the machine learning models, right? Like you never needed like 5 trillion tokens to train a model for like a month to get to something, right? So obviously these things are like very, very hard. They're too complex for anyone to go and investigate, and that's why things like model learning is such a hard problem to solve in these particular contexts, right? I think bias comes in all shapes and forms. A lot of times people don't even agree on whether something is a bias or not, or whether it is a cultural nuance in some sense, right? So there are a lot of flavors to that. In certain conditions, you can obviously like very neatly put a black and white to say that this is biased output, right? Like the classic example of where machine translation models refer doctors as men and nurses as women, right? So I think with the advent of these large language models, as what Danish also said, right? I think synthetic data has actually proven to be quite an interesting way in which we are able to balance out samples which otherwise would cause like bias towards a particular kind of an outcome, right? But again, there are challenges with respect to like synthetic data generation, because if you do not have original texts of a particular context, right, like then you are actually like translating, and you are potentially like not mitigating it 100%, right? We have so far spoken a lot about text based language models per se, right? Like, but we are in the multimodal era, and these systems can look at images, they can process audios and a lot of those things, right? So when we look at like representation or data, we are not talking about just the text data. Even like you can have similar issues with ASR and TTS, which forms like pipelines for your speech-to-speech systems, where if you do not have correct representation, some voices may be better heard than the other ones, right? So those are the kind of problems that you would definitely face. And there again, like ability to use data generated by Indians is a very interesting problem that comes into, right? Like, because if you look at the internet infrastructure, largely big techs actually own the infrastructure where a lot of like data generated by Indians actually reside. So even if you had to sort of like do contextual training in some sense, right, you would be limited with respect to like whether you have the ability, ownership, and licensing terms to be able to use that data or not, right? So those are some of the challenges that we have. I think there's a lot of work that has to be done in terms of expanding the understanding of bias, as well as product understanding of like situations in which these systems are deployed. Exactly what Kalika was saying, right? Like you cannot look at just an LLM, and also just to put it in context, right? An LLM is more like an engine now, right? We build agentic systems on top of it. You were never doing like chain of thought reasoning on your machine learning models, which were like doing translation and things like that, right? These and then you have like constructs like what Anthropic basically says, like a constitutional AI, where you You are creating these loops of thoughts before certain outputs come out. So you are doing like validation and reasoning. So these are not like necessarily related to training, but at the inference time compute, you are able to do certain things to ensure that you are within the guardrails, right? So I think the work has to happen at all the levels of like both having access to data which is like contextualized, local, being able to balance out samples, which again brings the question of like how would you know like what to balance if you do not know what to look for. And then you have like all of these agentic systems which are coming in, and they are continuing to sort of like become more and more mature, where you have to see whether in a particular context where these things are deployed, how are different genders reacting to it, right? So those are some of my reflections, Urvashi.
Thanks, Saurabh. And I think it's really interesting to, in some sense, to hear the level of agreement there is on the problem space, right? On what actually needs to be done. And even in the past kind of year and a half of working in this space, I think I'm seeing that more than ever before in terms of the articulation of what the issue is. But Saurabh, does that, like, given the scale of the complexity or just the nature of the challenge, does it mean that we should kind of slow down, or does it mean that we should have kind of disclosure methods to ensure that, when we are deploying these tools, there are the, adequate kind of guardrails or caveats in space? Like, how do we balance this, right? Because some of the things that we're talking about are not going to get solved anytime soon, and also will require a huge amount of resources to actually address them. So as a company that is both conscious of these challenges, but at the same time also looking to kind of move fast in this space, what is the kind of steps you're putting in place you think we need to put in place to kind of balance those two objectives?
It's hard, right? Like it's actually very hard for us to be able to balance these, and we are not unique in that sense, right? Like almost all the organizations who are working in the large language model space, right? Like it's hard to balance both the things. You inevitably do get like things wrong at points, right? But I think the systems and processes that we set within the organization helps. So we do a lot of like red teaming when we have a great team of like language experts who are looking at the model output and the training data, obviously at a sample basis. No human being is capable of like skimming through 5 trillion tokens in that sense, right? But building systems and processes, and exactly what Arushi was also saying, right? Like being able to iteratively build and deploy is very, very important. See, sometimes again, these systems are very, very complex, right? Like the whole emerging properties, or like the model will behave in ways where you don't expect it to, right? A lot of it will actually come, if you want something battle tested, you have to bring it to the battle, right? Like, so we have to continuously also deploy and take the user feedback in terms of incorporating those things. I think the work needs to happen, and some of the things that we are doing within the organization is by setting up systems and processes on both ensuring that the training data is neat and clean, does not have abuse and toxicity. Our model fares really well on some of those cores. Red teaming, building guardrails, both at the model level, but also when you are deploying them as part of something that is powering the agents, right? Like building guardrails around it is very, very important. And those are some of ways in which we do our bit of ensuring that these things are more balanced.
Thanks, Saurabh. I think, like, I mean, you don't use those words exactly, but maybe to put words in your mouth. Also, sometimes I feel like in the whole responsible AI piece, we also don't look enough at the kind of corporate governance part of it, right? Like at the end of the day, we also need organizations that have those internal checks and balances, because what we are dealing with is a lot of kind of uncertainty, and not just checks and balances which are related to the outcomes or outputs of the AI product, but just about having sound kind of internal practices. And we've seen how that when you don't have those in place, how that can kind of go wrong. And there's some pretty famous global examples of that currently. Safia, to turn to you, I think there's a lot of conversation or a lot of mention around the kind of data aspect of it, right? That we really need to think about how we're curating the data and doing that data work in a participatory way, doing that data work in a much more inclusive way. To me, as someone who's been kind of in the AI space for the past 6-7 years, it's very refreshing to hear now the amount of attention that has been given to the data work. Otherwise, often it was the kind of invisible, the invisible data workers or the invisibilized part of the whole kind of value chain. And of course, at Karya, that's exactly the work that you all do, is engaging with communities to build those data sets and kind of, and build kind of more participatory mechanisms for data curation. So could you shed a little bit of insight on how, what some of the challenges in doing that work is, and what are some of the investments or resources or steps one needs to kind of advance or grow the kind of space that you work in?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. So, I think in addition to many data workers being invisible, there's also the question of what are the lives that these people are living, and B, what are the actual opportunities that they can provide all of us that are, working in the LLM space today. So, a lot of the data, very frankly, that is collected, whether it be via scraping or whether it be via humans, has some level of unethicalness to it, right? A lot of data workers are not only working extremely long hours, but they're either working for free, earning substandard wages, or having to engage with harmful content, right? And I think, thank you. I think someone, I think Siddharth kind of pulled up this question in the kind of panel comments saying, how should we be thinking about compensation, right? And I think that is actually one of the most critical components when we're thinking about good data and good quality, right? So I think this is something that Arushi mentioned is one of the challenges that we have with representation when it comes to women in the data space, is literally not having enough women as data annotators and as data collection agents, right? This is for us, at least at Karya, and I believe honestly should be standard across the ecosystem, is one of the biggest things that we have to overcome if we actually want to make sure that our models are as powerful and as representative as we kind of hope for them to be, right? Crowdsourcing, we know it's an extremely powerful tool, but it's a more powerful tool if it's something that is employed with dignity and the people who are employed through that are actually valued, right? So I think the industry itself, we need to start thinking a little bit differently, centering actually data workers and their unique identities, because it is these subjectivities and unique identities that actually can help make this AI revolution, let's say, not only a creator and a booster of jobs, rather than just say a large place displacer, right? So, I think when we think about creating AIs and LLMs, especially for people in India, we need to make sure that they cater to this diverse cultural context that India provides, right? India has so much representation, not only in terms of language, but also in culture, and also in millions of people that want to use AI deeply, right? The only way that you can have people all the way from Patna to Goa having a use for AI is if all of their uniqueness is represented within that AI, right? So I think the future that we want is only possible if we really think about data quality and approaching data quality in that right way. Because we can't just hope that, if we scrape enough data or if we collect enough data without having, I think as Kalika said, the right types of guardrails for how that is created and how we define the very things that we're trying to mitigate, then we have no hope in actually being able to kind of, push this a little bit forward. One of our very first studies at Karya, we did it, and I think, Dr. Bali helped us with this study. We did it with a cohort of low-income women in Rajasthan. They had 10th pass education, no digital literacy, and were able to record Marwari speech data at a higher quality than existing professional data annotators. And there were two critical reasons for why that happened. They had dignified pay for the work that they were doing, and they had cultural pride in the work that they were doing because they understood what they were contributing to. I think these two things are really critical factors when we think about the AI value chain, right? We shouldn't just focus on, okay, does the model builder know enough about the world, about India to create a good model? It's all about, are all the people focusing on this problem involving the right people at every single step of the value chain to make the LLM more human, more contextual, and more culturally sensitive, right? I think everyone knows here the link between language and gender. It is something that we can't really pull apart. So if we want to actually address this challenge that we have in gender biases in Indian language LLMs, then we need to make sure that we're including women, that we're including as many people as possible. And the only way to I guess, overcome many of the salient challenges that I think, Abhishek sir brought up earlier today, is just making sure that the LLM value chains look different and that women are a key part of that. So yeah, that I hope is something that we can all work towards in the near future.
Thanks, Safia. And obviously the work that Kaya does is super inspiring in that context. One follow-up question that I had for you, just picking up on something that you said on the kind of cultural diversity in the country, right? Is that even if we do involve women in the kind of curation and labeling of these data sets, I mean, these women will not have the same set of values. And often, what their understanding of bias might be very different from what our understanding of bias might be. In some sense, women who are in a context, all of us as kind of urban, educated elite might have a certain notion of bias which doesn't quite resonate with what we see kind of playing out in people's homes, right, in terms of like gender distribution of work or gender roles, etc. So how do you deal with this issue of kind of inter-annotator disagreement, right, within the communities that you work with, and find that balance between kind of preserving what the community believes is their understanding of bias, but at the same time we also don't want to reproduce some of those understanding, right? So it's quite a kind of thorny problem in some sense. So I was just wondering if you had any reflections on that.
No, that's a really great question. So I think one of the most important things is not having this assumption that there is maybe necessarily one right answer. So I think there's, in our own project with the Gates Foundation, where we're trying to explore the mitigation of gender bias across 6 Indian languages through the employment of low-income women. I think the very first thing that we realized is that we had no idea how to even ask people what the definition of gender bias was in their own language, because that was not language that we actually knew how to communicate with people. So the very first step that we had to take, along with actually understanding what the data sets we already had were and trying to pull out the types of trends we might see in biases given existing frameworks that we had, the biggest learning there is that we really can't rely on one singular framework, especially when those frameworks may be Anglo-centric or may be very defined by the global north. So the very, I think, crucial part to trying to identify, and I'm not saying that we've solved this, but the beginning steps to figuring out how we actually want to mitigate gender bias is making sure that we have multiple perspectives in that room. I mean, one of the small activities that we did, which was actually very enlightening for me, was gathering groups of around 20 women from each of these language communities, from various kind of backgrounds of life, obviously a little bit more towards low income, to actually have them engage with the concepts of gender bias as they may traditionally be represented in a Western context, and understand how they actually relate to their everyday lives, and culminating with these women trying to collectively create a definition that made sense for them. And what was really interesting is that you can see, language by language, that there are different things that may resonate as important or very relevant for that language, right? So for example, when we were talking about, Hindi, there were a lot of discussions around profession, representation, being able to go out, going in, right? A lot of discussion around a woman's place actually in a space. When we were looking more towards Malayalam, there were a lot more discussions of authority, right? Where does a woman stand within household authority, within the village? And all of these things, while it may not be necessarily a cohesive definition right now, they give us glimpses and insights into how women see themselves within the cultural sphere and context. And when we find positive examples of those, that's really what we need to then accelerate and amplify into our LLMs, because that is what is going to make the LLM fundamentally gender inclusive, right? I don't think we can ever hope to make LLMs neutral in this way. I don't even think that's what we want from them, right? We want LLMs to have that human component. And the way we can insert that is by making them compassionate and understanding and able to express the various types of identities that women or other genders may be experiencing as they're navigating their kind of daily life. So the only way to get across that is by having heterogeneity in our data and taking the efforts to actually get your annotators together and have these discussions to understand why there might be differences, because sometimes while there might be a difference in annotation, there might actually be a consensus in the core value that someone has.
Thanks, Safi. And I think that's such an interesting point, that at the values level, there often might be more agreement than we think, even if the ways that value is expressed or manifested might look and feel different at a first instance. Maybe just going away a little bit now from the kind of application aspect of it, the data and the model, and really thinking about the kind of end goal of what we're trying to do, especially in the Indian context, right? Which is the use of these large language models, generative AI, to really advance some of the kind of social sector challenges that we see. And maybe I could bring you in that context. So, Digital Green has been working in the space of kind of digital agriculture long before LLMs, and in some sense, started off with, I love the Digital Green story of like the Pico projector, which I think is such fascinating technology, and in some sense using really like low tech in some sense to build kind of awareness and spread information in a community. So I wanted to, again, like I was saying, move away from the application and the questions of the model and data, and ask you a question about information in some sense in agriculture. So what we see is that a lot of the current applications right now are trying to fill information gaps, right? The kind of theory of change, or the thesis, is that if we provide women access to better information, more information, faster information, localized information, that will help them address some of the challenges they face, whether it's in healthcare and agriculture, etc. So, given the kind of wealth of experience that Digital Green has in this space, what is the role of information, and how important has been filling that information gap in addressing some of the inequities we see in the agricultural sector? And in some sense, how valid is that thesis? Do we need to refine that thesis? What have been the learnings from the past kind of decade or two of the work at Digital Green?
Thanks, Urvashi. I think the starting point could be with the acknowledgement that information is knowledge, knowledge is power, right? And especially when we are looking at certain marginalized communities where the gap could be filled in by giving them more knowledge. We at Digital Green have been working with that as a base to say that how information and knowledge can really help you to change certain practice, increase in income. Now, keeping all of that in mind, what we have seen is, access to localized, relevant, trustworthy information empowers, especially I'm talking in terms of the agriculture farmer background, empowers the woman farmer to take certain very informed decisions. And and to do that, they of course require something which is a little more specific, tailor-made, inclusive means of getting that information. What we have seen is that when it comes to any advisory, and this is not only now, but even in a conventional mode, uh, probably about 15 to 20% less women farmers would ask for advisory compared to the male farmers. Now, working with this assumption, one needs to also see that if the woman farmer has to be empowered, then what has to be the means to provide that information to the farmer? And of course, there is a complete acknowledgement that what I started with is that information or knowledge is helping the farmer to probably a change in behavior, better practices, all of that. Now, what we have seen is that especially when we are talking about anything which is a product which has AI element, everything is probably linked to something which is a device, right? Now, when we are designing something about how this information will reach the woman, we also have to address the digital literacy gaps. We have to address the gaps of saying that what is access to the devices. Now, keeping that in mind, one has to be saying that your approach or your product, your device has to be very gender intentional. Your product has to be like, it's making it gender intentional doesn't need to be afterthought. It has to be a part of your product design. I think that has to be the essential part out here. What we have been doing, we have developed this farmer.chat, which is an AI-based application where we are ensuring that the LLM trained on gender international data or information or content is actually the base. And keeping that in mind, we are ensuring that certain content, certain practices are being integrated out here which target specific women farmers out here. When it comes to a woman farmer, unlike a male farmer, the advisory they're looking for is not only about what is the weather like, or what pest control or what crop protection they should look at. They're also looking at certain social nuances out here, certain to say that if I want to be a board member in a FPO, how do I convince my family, right? Now, when we are looking at providing that information or making our application as an advisory means for the farmer, we need to keep all of that in mind. We have to ensure that our content is not only, or how we are pulling the content from the LLM is not only about actual crop advisory. It has to have other social elements into it. Along with that, what is the support out here is the timing for the women. Again, it's all about access to devices, right? So what we have gathered is that a lot of women use devices when the husband comes back from work, from the farm, wherever. So could be a evening, could be early morning, whatever it, and it could again vary from one state, one culture to the other, right? And also according to the seasons. So ensuring that whatever information is pushed, nudges, all of that is also keeping all those elements in mind, because that's the whole intentional bit out here, right? That has to be very important when you're designing, and that's what we have been saying, that it's not only about providing knowledge, it is about what is your means of providing knowledge, how are you building your content and pushing the content. And all the devices that we are talking about, we are talking about what we are talking about, something which is not gender responsive, but it is about being gender transformative. So it's like we are saying that things are okay, there is enough which is available, which is gender responsive, but it has to have the element of saying how things will get transformed for a woman farmer. So that's more like our approach that we've had. We are using a multimodal approach out here, voice to text, text to voice, bringing in the elements of images out here, catering to specific language needs of a woman farmer. But these are all again very intentional. So yes, the role of knowledge, advisory, information is very, very crucial to make anything successful, to ensure that there's a right usage, but it has to come with the right kind of intention and approach also. Yeah.
That's really interesting what you're saying. I think especially the point that, the knowledge base that we want to train these applications on is not just a technical knowledge base about like what in what climate a particular crop grows best, right? But that people are also looking for a broader set of kind of advice on how they can, access opportunities or improve their kind of social standing, etc. And it reminds me of also other research that we've seen where there's also a certain amount of application fatigue amongst communities, right? Where they don't want to be bombarded by 10 different apps, each providing a very specific kind of information, right? They'd rather have one application or two application where they can get a lot of that information. And so what we're seeing also is that, despite the rollout of many different types of applications, there's still like the WhatsApp and the YouTube, etc., where people go to for their information, right? And I think now with WhatsApp, with the kind of Meta AI kind of installed into it with the new update, that becomes a kind of default space for many of them. So I think there's a really interesting point that you're pointing to here, which is on really like what do people really want, right? And what is the kind of what are the kind of adoption trends that we see? I was wondering in that context whether you had anything to share on, how do you engage? How do you then go about building those knowledge data sets, or those curating that knowledge data set, so that it's not only agricultural specific information, but you're also providing more broader kind of social or socioeconomic advice in building and curating those data sets?
So, Rishi, I think, what you was just mentioning out here, it is also about, how do you also understanding their need, and that's also a lot about building their trust. Because I think when you mentioned that a woman is using, or anybody is more comfortable using WhatsApp or any other means, or there are multiple applications available, right? So it's a lot about then building a trust. And I think a way of doing ensuring that the right kind of content out there is a lot of work that we do on ground when we are rolling out these applications in different areas across the country. In fact, in multiple geographies. In fact, we've been also doing in Ethiopia, Kenya, all of that. Is to actually, we have a user research team which works with these communities to understand what is the need, right? Because it's not coming with assumptions that this is what they need. It is coming from understanding. They're doing pilots in levels to understand what is the need. Also, it is with the thing that you are trying to bring in the climate resilient or the gender focus out here. So then it is also about ensuring that the information or the behavior patterns that you're collecting are from maybe, for digital green, the best thing has over the years has been working with the government extension system, with the the frontline workers. So in ensuring that they are involved in all of this when we are collecting our data, also about in terms of also making it very localized. So when we are talking about certain training certain languages, all of that, then we are also ensuring that we are addressing the local needs out here, right? So in terms of, because it's for us, it's all about making it very, very localized. It's ensuring that if we are working in a particular block in Bihar or maybe in Andhra Pradesh, we should be able to pull that particular data from there. So their approach has been a combination of our years of experience of building the content, understanding what the need is from the community, because we work with these agri extension agents and government extension agents, and also then doing regular data collection, feedback, user research, evaluations from the ground to understand what is it that how we need to do to evolve the product further.
Thanks, Nidhi. Anahita, last but certainly not least, if I could bring you into this conversation. At the Gates Foundation, in some sense, you've been, and I think it's interesting that number of participants have referred to a Gates Foundation framework or a Gates Foundation kind of lingo around gender and digital development, which really speaks to some of the work that, the Gates Foundation has been doing in this space. So given kind of, the years of experience in the kind of gender and digital development space, are there lessons that, you think that we should keep in mind as we start introducing LLMs and integrating LLMs into critical domains?
Yeah, thanks, Urvashi, and thanks to you and Arushi and the team for putting this report together. I feel my job has been made pretty easy and also pretty complex by putting me in the last spot. But in the interest of time, I think a lot of what Nidhi was talking about is what I'd like to build on, which is the grounding about what we are doing, who we are serving, what the problem statement we want to go after, right? So before I get into lessons, I think very quickly, and we spoke about this, right? Like the reality, and Kalika spoke about this, is the reality changes every 100 meters in terms of what local context we're talking about and how we want to design for that. And oversimplifying by saying that, even when we say contextually driven, frameworks to evaluate some of this, it's just very complex. And even if we think about taking a step back, a gender sensitive framework or a gender aware framework, it looks at so many different parameters, right? It'll look at your individual and systemic levers. It'll look at social, informal and formal norms. And then embedding that into the LLM frameworks, like what Arushi was mentioning, becomes a challenge. The second thing I wanted to quickly also touch upon was the gender digital divide and who you are designing for. I think when we talk about frontline workers, since that came up, 50 to 60% of their time, at least on the health and nutrition side, is spent on data collection, mobile phone, different gadgets that sometimes come in. There'll be a tab also sometimes which they lock up because that should not get hampered and needs to be maintained. There'll be forms, etc. Now, I was on a field visit very recently, and one of the workers was seeing them in action, and the first thing that she said was, you've given me a phone, great. The government has given a phone, but can we just be trained on how to increase the font and basic literacy, right? So when we're thinking about designing for the frontline workers, or even in the LMIC construct, where over 400 million women in the LMICs are using digital services. But if you look at health as a use case, only 16% of them use that for anything related to health, right? Either service delivery or even knowledge. And 600 million women remain unconnected. So when we're thinking about some of this, and we're thinking about representation and data sets and contextualization and localization, it's important to layer that in. And your report on, the 780 language plus dialects that we're talking about, to be able to layer this complexity becomes increasingly important. I think the work that Karya has done to take this back to the community, to bring the women in. I think there are a lot of other models we need to think about systemically, as well as, working with implementation agencies, and the SHGs, the self-help groups, or the frontline workers become a part of that. From our perspective, when I think about the role we need to play and the lessons we've learned, I think you spoke about corporate governance. I can't talk much on that, but as funders, when I tell somebody to fill a gender marker for an investment, and I'm sure some of you who may have worked with us may have had to fill that. I think even as an investment officer, what does that really mean? Like, at what stage, what question? And then layering the LLM constructs around that becomes really tough, right? And I think instead of saying that, we want gender intentionality in everything and do this, I really think we need to make it easier. And as funders, we need to play that role of facilitation, getting those easy to use playbooks to even identify some of these blind spots. I don't think the tech providers or the startups want to do any of this intentionally, right? But I was recently having a conversation where one of this AI startup founder, he said, it was a blind spot for me. I didn't realize my prompt engineering team was all male. And we did not think about some of the prompts, which we eventually realized there was a lot of challenges around, because it was accentuating stereotypes, or it was causing harm, which was all unintended, right? I think that's a role we need to play. But from a learning perspective, I think we've all spoken about this, but keeping the user front and center and not assuming the problem statement, and how much scale can be achieved from the problem statement, to my mind, is an absolute one. We've spoken about as digital human-centered design for years altogether, but somewhere along the way, because of our priorities to want to deliver, to want to get things done fast, we somewhere along the way start assuming at the multiple life cycle approaches or the continuum of what could be the user's requirements. And that becomes a challenge. I think the second would be that while sure, we need to respond quickly in terms of the AI ecosystem, I think we need to respond quickly from a responsible AI use perspective and the research perspective. So like I think Dr. Singh, Mr. Singh had also mentioned this, that we need to fund and co-create on the research base to make it much more actionable. But I don't think we need to go as quickly when it comes to, use cases and then developing something and rolling it out. We need to be a lot more intentional, because at the end of the day, that requires validation, and it's not a one-time exercise. I think the third thing, which as a foundation we've learned, and with AI, it's only getting even more difficult. We talk about DPGs and we talk about all of these open source tools, etc. Procurement is a very big challenge. You don't have enough ecosystem players getting validated or understanding the code base for these DPGs for the government to be able to procure. We all understand how government procurement in a lot of LMIC contexts and in India works. And if you are to help them build trust on these solutions, whether it's AI being used a lot more upstream or even downstream in the context of some of the LLM solutions, we need to think about how are we thinking about the validation frameworks, MLE frameworks across the board. And I think that's, again, a learning we've had, because we need to think about scale. And to think about scale, you need to ensure that the solution is able to be procured and then scaled. And those missing steps about what that market play looks like becomes increasingly important. I think the last thing I'll probably also say is that to be able to inform some of this, the market will come up with different use cases, right? And I don't think there is a dearth of that. But we do need to build capacity to be able to think about gender intentionality across those pathways. And I don't think there is enough incentive to be able to think about this. But I think increasingly we can actually create business use cases for people to want to think about the ROI as they think about what percentage of the population is getting missed out if you don't actually think about them proactively. And I don't see that happening very organically. It'll have to continue to be, and the kind of work that you all have done, to be brought back into the ecosystem through conversation, easy to use playbooks, easy to use, questions that can be asked or levers that can be taken into account as we do that. I'll pause. I know we're on time.
Thanks, Anita. Lots to kind of chew on. Just as a follow-up question on the kind of incentives and building that business case for a responsible AI. I mean, this is not an easy question, of course, but how do we go about doing that? And I think procurement could be one, isn't perhaps an interesting way, but maybe, procurement helps set standards for responsible AI, and procurement becomes a way that the government shapes the market towards responsible AI. But any other thoughts on kind of that incentive piece? Because it's interesting to see in the past couple of years how there is now, we're all speaking at least a very similar language around responsible AI, which wasn't the case, let's say, 4 or 5 years ago. But how we've fixed that incentives gap is obviously a complex question.
It is a complex question, but I do feel, in short, if I were to oversimplify it, you will see adoption suffer. Right. And if not sooner, because we've seen uptake, and we've seen that with digital as well. You'll mandate certain things, people will start using them. But as and when you realize it's not answering the questions which are relevant for certain parts of the population, whether it's marginalized communities, we're taking women as a group more broadly, across gender identities, we increasingly realize people stop using it and look out for something else. Right. So that's the whole use case and the business case for user research. Right. So I do think it's going to be a tough one to crack, but I think that layered with, working with, I mean, at least from my perspective, we continue to try to work with different social sector ministries to think about what their validation frameworks will look like, to be much more intentional before something gets into the market, right? And there are some very open questions around this, and Urvashi, you're aware of this. So I think what we want to continue to at least do is that it's a struggle to be thinking about these business cases, but if some of these levers can be kept in mind, we can at least start showing, if you keep these levers in mind, this is the market reach that can increase, or this is the user base that can increase. I think Girl Effect, as an example, it's one of the investments I work with, teams I work with, comes to mind. They picked up English. They started with something as basic as menu-based chatbots for SIH, but they continuously went around, and now they're using NLP, but they continuously went around identifying what are those colloquial ways of actually having these interactions with the target base they're talking about. How do we go about doing that using different local languages, or build, layer into Bhashni, for example, and leverage it more effectively, but keeping the user front and center to be able to scale. And now they're scaled across 11 states. So I think we'll have to build more evidence around this. We can't go away from that. But as and when we see that, the different providers start to see adoption increase, start to see marketplace for them to be able to be in as a part of the procurement cycle increase, it'll in turn start pumping in some of those changes. But it's going to be complex. I agree with you.
Thanks, Anita. And I think it also kind of underlines the importance for that kind of MLE piece that we desperately now need in the Indian ecosystem. We are at time, and I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to get to all the questions that people have posed in the chat. Some of them were very kind of specific questions to panelists on particular technical aspects of this. And maybe what we'll try and do is just follow up with the panelists, and we post some of the answers on our social media so you can access them there. But maybe just one kind of final closing question, which touches upon some of the questions already in the chat, and a closing question to all of you, which would be around, what role do you see government playing in this ecosystem? We know the India AI mission has a huge budget. We heard about some of the plans from Mr. Singh in the beginning of this conversation. What would be your kind of recommendations for the India AI mission, or government more generally, in building the kind of ecosystem that many of you are talking about? And maybe Kalika, I could start with you, and then we could just go in the order that we had the Q&A earlier.
Yeah, so I don't think government has to do anything particular except enforce the laws that are already there. I mean, in the sense, we've had discussion about this earlier as well, and Mr. Singh also said something about it. The thing is that the Constitution, going back to the workshop that you conducted earlier and what I learned from it, and I've been thinking a lot about it, guarantees equality to all citizens of the country, right? Like irrespective of gender. And the thing that the government has to do is to kind of say that, maybe work with the policy people, work with the technology folks to come up with a set of guidelines that this is how this law has to be enforced when you're doing, AI-based systems or models. And I don't think there's anything more that the government needs to do. Of course, the government is supporting a lot of specific areas in responsible AI, including gender, a lot of support for and funding for databases as well, right? Like creating databases across Indian languages, etc. So I think all that is really good. But in responsible AI, our focus actually becomes more on safety. So, if you heard Saurabh also talked a lot about harm and toxicity and how, but we do not see the long-term effects of some of these things. Like it is true that bias is not going to, probably gender bias is not going to kill somebody immediately. I hope not. I mean, there can be edge cases, but the long-term damage of this is much stronger and much more permanent. So I think the government just needs to keep an eye on this and make sure that what already exists is enforced in some way or the other.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thanks, Kalika. Danish?
Yeah, I think like Mr. Singh already said, more investment in the area would help. We have few groups that already do great research, but that's comparable to maybe one large university in the US. So we really need to have more of these. And now we have newer IITs, and with NEP, there's like a need for more. And I think more investments, more transparency, less bureaucracy. All of them would really help.
Thanks, Danish. Saurabh?
Yeah, I mean, as everyone was speaking, I was thinking like there's a lot of difference between guidelines, notifications, amendments, and laws, right? Like, and all of them have very different effect with respect to the kind of stuff that they would do to businesses, and both in terms of incentivizing, like organizations, as well as acting as deterrents. I think. Very uniquely, I think Indian government is like very uniquely positioned. It governs like a fifth of the world population in some sense, with a very, very vast diversity. Collecting data is actually one of the things that Bhashni has done very well, which I hope like continues to be a case to bridge the gap. Otherwise, like it'll be very hard even for businesses to be able to do collection for such a representation. I think, and why just government, right? I would even say even community effort has to go into this. I think it's just big enough elephant that everyone has to do a little bit of like contribution and all of those things. So I think from a regulation and that standpoint, I think working alongside industry to understand what we are trying to do, how we are trying to do it, and then even thinking about like doing softer nudges instead of like bringing a hammer to break things would be one of the things that I would want Indian government to do in some sense. Other than that, I think we have like a pretty strong legal framework to deal with the kind of harms and risks that we talk about in terms of LLMs, and I think we should continue to explore if there are things that current legal system or like current legal framework is sort of lacking. But yeah, I think I would just say like we have to democratize knowledge around some of these things. I think one thing that I continue to hear from everyone is that I don't know how this works, so how do you expect me to contribute, right? And if that being the case, I think we have a very strong case to sort of like democratize knowledge, and in a lot of these areas, know-how is really what the moat is, right? So the more you are able to sort of like align incentives so that there are more people who are able to build this technology, play with this technology, provide feedback, build evaluation data. I think we need to do more of it, not less of it in some sense, is what I would say. It's just that the number of activities we need to do has to be very, very diverse, not just one. That's what I would say. And government has a very important role to play in that sense.
Thanks, Saurabh. Safia?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would very much tend to agree with what's kind of been said, and I want to focus a little bit more on, I think, the opportunity that the government has right now. So I think one thing that we've absolutely outlined is, of course, the legal frameworks that do exist. I think that definitely have to just kind of be doubled down on if we are going to create this kind of ecosystem where India can be a leader. But I think also, I mean, as was kind of mentioned earlier, I think there is a growing understanding among the government that we have to actively engage in AI and that we actively have to budget for certain things like data collection. And I would say, let's push that even further. Let's think about how can the government, when thinking about these guidelines, how can those translate into evals and benchmarks? How can those translate into kind of guidelines that can be assumed across all of the entities that we have within India? And then how can we also think about the actual data creation as an opportunity, not only for the government itself, right, through initiatives like Bhashini, but also for people that are deeply in need of work, right? I mean, even us personally, there is a huge benefit that we find through working directly with self-help groups and FPOs. These are directly constructs of the government. And I think there's a huge potential to leverage these communities and have them be deeply involved with this work, not only helping people gain more income, but also helping with the large scale evaluation and benchmarking of these models in the way that we want them to be.
Thanks, Safia. Nidhi?
Yeah, so I'm just going to add one point out here very quickly is that, especially for us, because we work with the government extension system. So I think somewhere, and we are finding a lot of cooperation, openness from the government, but a little bit more investment in terms of building the capacities of the government frontline workers to use the AI, the newer technologies, all of that. While there is an openness, but there's still a huge gap. So somewhere, whether it means more investment into that or more capacity building, but whatever it is, that's where the gap is, and that's where we need to address. Yeah.
Thank you. And Anita, finally, over to you.
Thanks. I think just two quick points. Somebody had mentioned about the IITs, I think Danish had mentioned, but I just generally wanted to say that states are now figuring out what their AI strategies are going to be. And I work in health a lot, so there is a lot of that thinking on how we think about this. So while there are the COEs that have been set up, I think in addition to that, thinking about how to build local capacity in some of the institutes, I work a lot in UP Bihar, in such states and similar others, would be very helpful, because there will be, again, coming back to context, problem statements, data sets, language barriers, which some of that can be addressed. So that's one point. And I think the government is already doing a lot through the India AI mission, and I think the market piece Saurabh had covered as well. But I think we need to also start, if I bring it back to gender intentionality in AI, things that can be done and how to do them should continue to be the mojo in which some of this is done, rather than, what should be done and why it is done. I think I'm hoping that we can at least move the needle, as you said, that we're aligned on what the problem statement is now. But, and in that context, looking at the social sector ministries in a much more cross-cutting way, and how some of the use cases can be thought about for that, because there is something to be said about the research that we do, but then there is the application that we need to be more intentional about, and they will need that support as we go along thinking about layering AI there, right? So thinking about the evaluation models there, and then linking it back to regulatory pathways would be something that I'd probably think about the government can continue to do more of. Thanks, Avish.
Thanks, Anita. And thank you all for this conversation. I think we had such a nuanced conversation that really went into some of the specifics of this space, and really also kind of laid out a very progressive and forward-looking agenda, a complicated agenda nonetheless, but also a progressive agenda in terms of what needs to be done. And I think what we managed to do in this conversation was really kind of avoid some of the regular tropes that we often hear in this space. So I really want to thank you all for bringing your insights, bringing your experience to this conversation. And I'm very sorry to all the people who have logged in that we couldn't answer all of those questions. But like I said, we'll try and share some answers to the specific technical questions, especially through our social media channels. A big thank you to Arushi and the DFL team for all the work that has gone into producing this report. The links are in the chat, so please do have a look. And we would love your feedback. And even for us, we think this is just the beginning of this conversation. And I think our discussion today has only reinforced that there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of collaborative work that that is required. So I hope we can, kind of continue to work with all of you. And finally, a huge thanks to Anaita and to the Gates Foundation also for supporting this work, but also and for kind of shepherding us through this and and helping us kind of keep our eye on who are we trying to inform with this work. It's very easy sometimes when one is doing research work to kind of get lost in the research bubble and not think about the kind of end user of that research product as well. So, we really got lots of great feedback from Anaita and her team on how to make this as useful for the kind of broader community that this work is targeted at, as well as the advisory board that was supporting this work, and Saurabh and Kalika, who were both on the advisory board as well. So thank you all very much for joining us, and hope to connect with you all very soon. Thank you.